Hi everyone, so today I'm going to be presenting the Armenian Genocide. So to start off with the question is, how did international political interest and global indifference contribute to the lack of intervention during the Armenian Genocide, and what impact has that had on modern responses to the genocide? So to start off with the historical context, the Armenian Genocide happened throughout the years of 1950 to 1917, and the main targeted groups were obviously the Armenian people, who were hunted down by the Turkish people, and this caused 1.5 million Armenians to die. And the Ottoman government feared that Armenians would support Russia, who was an enemy in World War II, and they feared that the Armenians would support Russia in the war, and many people died from starvation, exposure, violence, and the Turkish people would storm through the towns and wreck the cities and also kidnap people. And the Turkish army would tell the Armenians that they were being reloaded for safety, but in reality, they were just sent to concentration camps or left to die in the desert. So for my next slide, for the causes, the first thing is the rising Turkish. So the Ottoman Empire was weakening and it was losing its territory, and the Turkish leaders wanted to create a purely Muslim Turkish state. And so the religious and ethnic hatred was spread throughout all the years because there was long-standing discrimination against the Armenians, who were Christian and mostly a Muslim empire. And the Armenians were often treated as second-class citizens and faced suspicion and prejudice. And the other cause is that the fear during World War I, because the Ottoman Empire was fighting Russia and the Armenians lived the Russian border, and the leaders falsely believed that the Armenians would side with Russia and betray the empire. So for the next slide about the causes, the political power struggles were very broad, because the Young Turks, a political group in power, just wanted to centralize control and blamed the Armenians for the empire's problems, and they used the war as a cover to remove the Armenian population and take their land and wealth. And there was also a lot of economic motives, which was that the Armenians were often wealthy merchants, landowners, and professionals, and by deporting or killing them, the government and others could take their property and businesses. And the other point is the failure of international community, which was where other countries were focused on World War I and didn't act quickly to stop the killings. And the Ottomans knew that there would be little to no punishment, which is why they continued without fear of consequences. So for the mythology, which has to do with why countries didn't intervene, is because the international political interests. And this just means that World War I, like I said before, World War I was happening, so most powerful nations like Britain, France, and the US were just too focused on the war and not humanitarian issues. And countries didn't want to anger the Ottoman Empire because they had political or military alliances to worry about. And some countries needed the Ottoman Empire for strategic reasons and didn't want to interfere with what was going on. And again, World War I was just a really big factor that played a part during the Armenian Genocide, which is why not many people were focused on the killings and the genocide, and they didn't really do much about it. And so the other point were the colonial powers, because they were committing violence in their own territory, so they didn't want to criticize others. So the next point that I have is the mythology, and this basically starts off with the global indifference, and this is basically the lack of action or care, and there was little international pressure to stop the genocide, which is why even though diplomats and missionaries reported what was happening, many governments didn't act upon it, and the world had no system like the United Nations or international courts to respond to the genocide. And some people didn't believe the reports, or just saw it as an quote-unquote internal Ottoman issue, which is why not many people wanted to like be a part of it because they just didn't want to like risk their own lives. So continuing on with the mythology that occurred during the Armenian genocide was the impact on modern responses to the genocide. And this was basically just about how the failure to act during the Armenian genocide showed that the silence and indifference can lead to mass deaths. And this failure influenced later atrocities like the Holocaust, Rwandan genocide, and Darfur, where early warnings were also ignored. And this helped lead to the creation of international human rights law, and the term quote-unquote genocide itself was then defined by Raphael Lemkin. And today it's a reminder of the importance of speaking up early and taking action when signs of genocide appear. So for the next slide about international responses to the Armenian genocide, this basically started off with the witnessing and reportings that started to occur later throughout the genocide, which helped make the genocide be known throughout other countries and nations. And this started with the U.S. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau Sr., who was sent repeated reports to Washington describing the atrocities as a campaign of race extermination. And there were also missionaries and diplomats from the U.S. and Germany and other countries who also reported the mass killings and sufferings that were occurring throughout the genocide because they wanted it to be known about the conditions that the Armenians were going through and how much they suffered. And so another point is how there were also foreign newspapers that were published. They published stories and photos to raise awareness of this atrocity. And there were also Ottoman officials who were arrested, and this basically just helped the genocide more in depth because they were able to arrest the people who were part of this genocide. Even though they couldn't arrest everyone, they still at least arrested the main people who were basically the officials of the Ottoman Empire. And the Republic of the Turkey decided that the genocide was just a genocide itself, when at first there was lots of denial and just bickering back and forth. But many countries avoided calling it a genocide for decades to protect the diplomatic ties of Turkey, until afterwards they had realized that they couldn't deny anymore because it was just factual that it was a genocide that occurred during that time. So the question that obviously everyone's wondering is how and why did the Armenian genocide end? And so it basically started off with the Ottoman Empire losing the war, and they lost the war and collapsed shortly afterward. With the empire being defeated also, the Young Turk leaders who organized the genocide fled the country to avoid punishment. And so the new government that followed didn't continue the mass killings, though they also didn't fully help survivors, but they at least prevented like any other mass tragic event happening like this. And so the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was just that the empire was already weak and lost major territories by 1918. And with the empire being gone, its genocidal policies and military campaigns came to a halt. And so the flight of the perpetrators is basically that the main leaders of the genocide, who were Talat, Enver, and Jamal Pasha, fled to Europe or Central Asia, and many were never held accountable, even though a few were later assassinated by Armenian survivors as part of Operation Nemesis. And the international humanitarian aid organized organizations, which were called the Near East Relief, and other foreign missions to regain rescuing survivors, especially orphans and women. And these efforts helped prevent further deaths from starvation, disease, and exposure. Because of the horrible conditions that everyone was in, they tried their best to just help everyone who was still at least somewhat like healthy and at least alive. And this really helped keep the numbers up instead of decreasing the numbers even more. So the next slide is obviously to talk about the justice and remembrance of this genocide. And so basically, the Ottoman trials were occurring throughout the years of 1919 to 1920. And this was just how after World War I, the Ottoman Empire held short-lived military tribunals that convicted several officials for crimes against Armenians, and some were sentenced to death, but most escaped punishment or were let go when political power shifted. And there were no international courts existed at the time to handle crimes like the genocide, so there was no global justice system to hold the Ottoman government accountable. But for the modern day Turkeys, they continue to deny that the genocide occurred, making justice recognition even harder. Until then, there was then something that was created, which was just a remembrance on the date of April 24th, and it is basically recognized by Armenians worldwide as Genocide Remembrance Day. And the day in 1915, when the Armenian intellectuals were first arrested in Constantinople. And there were also memorials that were built around, especially in Armenia, like the Tzikr Kambird Memorial, and in other countries with Armenian communities, including the US, France, and Lebanon. And there were also survivor testimonies, which helped explain people's stories and points of views to everyone to get a better understanding and knowledge of what people actually went through. So there were books, films, and academic studies to help preserve the memory and teach new generations. And many countries now officially recognize the genocide, including the US through Turkey. So to finish this off, my key takeaway or summary is that the Armenian genocide showed how international political interest and global indifference can have devastating consequences when countries choose not to intervene in mass atrocities. And during World War I, powerful nations were focused on their own battles and avoided confronting the Ottoman Empire, partly because they needed political alliances and were unwilling to risk conflict. And even though diplomats and missionaries reported the horrors, there was still little action beyond humanitarian aid and no military intervention to stop the genocide. And this lack of response allowed the killings to continue until the Ottoman Empire collapsed and its leaders fled. But after the genocide, only a few Ottoman officials faced justice, and the absence of the international courts meant most perpetrators escaped punishment. But today, the Armenian genocide is remembered through memorials and official recognitions by many countries, but Turkey's denial and geopolitical concerns still complicate full acknowledgement. This history shows how political self-interest and silence can enable genocide, and it stresses the importance of global awareness and early intervention to prevent future tragedies. Understanding this helps explain why the world's responses to genocide has evolved, but also why challenges remain.